The nation's debt stands at about $33.8 trillion. That's about 124% of the country's GDP. The government can only really raise taxes and cut spending. But is that enough to get a handle on the debt? Lawmakers are working on it. Some are calling on a commission to come up with realistic ways to approach it. Last week, we spoke to Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's, about the ballooning debt. And this is what he had to say.
It's a big problem because debt plus higher rates means higher interest payments. Here's a factoid for you. We're going to be paying soon more in interest expense on our debt than we do to fund our defense budget. I mean, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so we've got to make some changes. And, if you look at current law, if we make no changes in tax policy or spending policy, it's just unsustainable. Our debt load is going to rise to a place where the interest rates are going to rise. The economy is going to cave under the weight of all of that. So we've got to make some changes.
Now, as the year wraps up, it's time to balance the country's checkbook and how it impacts markets. For more on this, we have Maya MacGuineas of Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget President. So, Maya, we want to weigh in on this with the debt thermometer, if you will. What does the debt thermometer tell us about where we stand, and are we in a danger zone?
Right. Yeah. So one of the really helpful things about the tool of the debt thermometer, I think, is it tracks all of the policies that are implemented in a year and what their effects are going to be on the debt going forward. So if you take this year so far, in terms of our actual deficit, how much we borrowed, it was much worse than it should have been. It basically doubled from the previous year during a period where the economy was strong. But at the same time, lawmakers actually passed policies that improved the situation significantly. Really notable because it's the first time that's happened in a decade. The deficit reduction came almost exclusively from the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was that negotiation they had around the debt ceiling. They avoided debt defaulting, and they put in place some spending caps that were going to limit the budget going forward. But here's the rub. So far, they haven't actually been able to agree on those spending caps, so we're not sure whether they'll stay in place. Plus, there's a lot of very important emergency spending they're probably going to have to pass at the end of the year, foreign aid for all the emergencies around the world. And the question is, will they be willing to offset those costs or not? So while the debt thermometer is looking good so far this year, there's still a couple of weeks left, and there's real concern that the situation is going to get even worse than it has been. And obviously going forward, just like Mark Zandi was saying, the debt situation is unsustainable, very bad, big changes need to be made.
Yeah, my recent conversation with Scott Sperling at THL, he's the co-CEO there. I asked him just about, or he was talking about fiscal spending, driving rates, exactly what this means in terms of debt, financing it for the long term. How scary is this really? Because this is a topic, and you and I have talked about it now for years. Obviously, it comes up multiple times a year. It's something that probably should come up more often if you're asking someone like you. But investors and even Americans brush it aside. Can you put it in plain terms why we should be so worried about this?
Absolutely. So certainly the markets have been sort of short-term focused on this, which is it will only become a problem when it's a problem. But once it does, it will turn bad quite quickly. And the risk was that when interest rates stayed low for so long, there are many people out there saying, we should borrow more. Borrowing is free. That, of course, isn't true. If you borrow $1 trillion, you still have to pay that $1 trillion. It's just the carrying cost of capital is lower than it otherwise would be. But we now have a lot of that debt that's actually coming due because it's turning over so quickly. And the high debt load, along with the higher interest rates, which in part responded to the inflation that came from all the extra borrowing, means that our interest payments are now the single fastest growing part of our budget. Not only will they eclipse defense, we already spend more on interest than we do on all programs for children. But here's the real risk. It used to be that the biggest concerns were economic. This would slow growth. That's left us vulnerable. I would argue that now the biggest risk is national security. We are at a critical moment geopolitically. We need to have resources and flexibility, both for the things that are erupting around the world, but also for issues like climate and AI. And we just don't have the budget flexibility to respond in the way we should. And this is that moment that people have been warning about, where you borrow so much, you're very fiscally weak, and that affects all parts of your country.
What needs to happen policy-wise in 2024 to reduce any possibility of the U.S. defaulting on its debt?
So the default can only happen when we're about to hit the debt ceiling. That's not scheduled to 2025. One of the reasons I think this fiscal commission people are talking about is such a productive idea is we could not only put into place a debt deal, a blueprint for how to bring the debt down, we could deal with reforming the debt ceiling so default is no longer a risk. For this coming year, 2024, I think the big opportunity/risk is the presidential election. Are we going to have candidates who are promising not to fix these problems, not to deal with the national debt or pretending you can grow your way out of it, which you cannot, promising not to touch Social Security and Medicare, which need to be fixed? Or are you going to have candidates who have a realistic discussion about the fact we need to make some choices? And by the way, anyone who's promising not to touch taxes or spending, neither's true. In order to really deal with this, we will have to do a little bit of everything. Actually, a medium amount of everything because we've waited so long. So I do hope we can have an honest political discussion, which will set us up for some real action under the next administration to deal with the debt and the insolvency of the trust funds.
Maya, I'm curious to get your perspective on this because when the debt ceiling deal had been reached, there was a little bit of criticism from some of the GOP presidential contenders just on that deal. Of what you have heard from those who could potentially go up against Biden, are there any that are taking the debt and what we have seen play out in this country seriously?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm just watching the debates like other people, and we run a project called U.S. Budget Watch, which tracks what the candidates are saying. But you've heard a Nikki Haley, you've heard a Chris Christie, both talk quite honestly about the fact we will have to make changes. And then you've also heard a President Trump and a President Biden promise not to fix Social Security or Medicare. We haven't seen their overall plans yet. We don't know how they will add up. But people who are being honest about the need to make changes are the ones who are setting an administration up to actually have been honest and start to put in place the kinds of changes on the revenue side and the spending side that are going to be necessary if we want to get this situation under control. And I say that as a diehard political independent, and we are nonpartisan, but we are listening closely to who is talking about the issue in a way that's leveling with the taxpayers.
So when you say you're diehard independent, what needs to happen to both spending programs like Social Security? When you think about, there's obviously been talk for years about how long Social Security will last, and on the taxation side, what's the solution?
Yeah. So first, what needs to happen politically is there needs to be bipartisan cooperation because no party can do this on their own because the real policy choices are difficult. And if you have the other party, demagoguing and writing campaigns ads against you, it won't work. When it comes to Social Security, the program will be insolvent in about a decade. And if we don't make changes, and we've already waited too long, there will be across the board benefit cuts of 23%. That's plain stupid, and I would argue immoral to the people who depend on the program. We should look at things like raising the retirement age for younger workers who are going to be living longer and can adjust accordingly. We should slow the growth of benefits for those who are more well off and possibly increase them for the people who depend on the program more. And we should talk about raising the payroll tax cap so more revenues go in. That's Social Security. Medicare, we also have to make changes. We need to control the cost of healthcare overall. When it comes to revenues, there's lots of options. We could look at the $1.5 trillion in tax breaks that we have every year in lost revenue. We could look at a new revenue source like a carbon tax. We could look at how we tax capital income. There are so many options. It's just that they're not easy politically. And we have been bombarded by free lunches from every side for so long. People believe that you don't have to do any work to fix this, but you can't borrow for decades and expect that problem to just disappear. We now are going to have to change the way we budget. And I would argue it's just so important to do it now because really the risks that we're seeing around the world are a reminder of why we need to be strong fiscally so that we can respond with strength to the various things that we are being confronted with at this moment.
The national debt certainly is extremely high, $33 trillion and counting. Maya MacGuineas, always great to get your perspective here, your insight. Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget President. Maya, thanks.